I'm Dave Potter with Digital Journal. We're here at Inventures in Calgary, and I'm joined by Shawn Mahoney of Spare Parts and Gasoline. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So just for our viewers who may not be familiar, can you tell me a little bit about Spare Parts and Gasoline?
Spare Parts and Gasoline is a boutique consulting company here in Calgary. We focus on change and helping organizations, people, communities go through change.
And change, and you mentioned people, you also have something called Life After BigCo. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think when you say, we have, it's not exactly correct. I think it's something we're trying to encourage in our community. And it's more of a movement than something we own. But it's intended to help people navigate, the changing workforce. And, it started out of the idea that, I was transitioned from my job, as were many people in that exact moment in time. And, it was challenging for them to navigate that. And these were all talented people with tons of training and tons of experience. And, they maybe couldn't see all their choices. And so we thought, can we build a community? Can we build supports for people in those transitions? Was where we started.
And what's the first thing that people deal with when they are sort of find themselves in that situation where they've been at BigCo for a long time and suddenly that structure that was always part of their life is gone?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single story. But, I think one of the hardest things is probably identity. I think people blur their personal identity with their organizational identity. And depending on how long or how much you believed in the identity of the organization, that can be extremely painful to separate.
And what do you recommend somebody does? What's the first step somebody should be taking?
That is it. And I think allow yourself to feel and maybe sit in that for a little bit. That's not a comfortable time, but I think when you're hurting, it's difficult to do the right next step forward. And it may be easy to get back into something that is familiar, but maybe it's not where you're supposed to be anymore.
And how does Life After BigCo help address that? What are you guys working on doing?
Well, we started, there's actually, first is to kind of maybe change the narrative. And, one of the things that we learned was with the transitions of the people leaving these larger companies, startups were actually having more success. There was more startups in Calgary. They were actually being more successful. And that was an interesting thing, in that when we shared that to the community, it maybe changed. Instead of feeling like they were discarded, they were actually part of something that was important in our community.
What's the biggest challenge? I mean, you've gone from BigCo to startup. It's a different world. Mm-hmm. What was the most shocking thing or the biggest adaptation you've had to make?
I think there's a million. And I do think this is, again, not everybody's story, but I do think there's kind of familiarity in patterns. And I think one of the things that I don't know if this is the correct way to say it, but you had kind of a pack. And so I would get up in the morning at 7 o'clock and there would be a pack of people on the exact same path as me. So there was comfort in the herd and the rituals and patterns. And you get used to it and you miss them, even if you didn't like them. Like so many meetings in a day. Well, I started to miss them. I missed even things I didn't like at the time.
And how did you go about addressing that? Or how did you go about tackling that change?
Well, I think, you have to establish a new normal. And for me, that was about busy. I think I was very busy at my time when I was working for a big company. And it feels that way. There's lots of meetings. It's hard to find productive time. And I realized I carried that into my post-BigCo existence. And I had the good luck of a bad luck event that caused me to reflect on that. And I realized if I just stop being busy and I kind of take that time where I have time to go do deep thought, it started to change. But it didn't change in a day. It's still changing over months and years.
Do you, obviously there's an opportunity for startups, whether somebody's starting their own company or they're potentially being hired. What do you think the big advantage of somebody who's coming from a BigCo brings to a smaller organization?
I think we take for granted what we know, and you're normal. And, one of the things that I think is there's a lot of structures and things that are well thought out in big organizations, and you can leverage those to amplify, and those are actually fantastic. But if you're in a slightly smaller or mid-sized organization, maybe they haven't matured into those. And so knowing what a future might look for a mid-sized company or even a small company is very valuable. Something that you took for granted as water that you just swam in is actually really helpful to companies that are trying to navigate their way up to a larger company.
What's the flip side of that? What's the downside that comes with?
You have to unlearn. I think the pace of work can be a lot faster when you're a company of 5 than it can be 5,000. And I think learning to work at pace, when you're a small company, and the way you think and the way you act, and maybe budget, you might think you need to spend a lot of money, but you don't. And so, I think reframing how you attack problems and how you actually become more creative in how you solve them, instead of learning that this is the way we always solve it, it's like, well, no, there's many ways to solve these problems. Let's find the one that fits for us.
In the work that you're doing or in your personal experience, how would you advise somebody to know whether the jump to a startup or a small business is the right choice for them after a big co, or whether they're not cut out for it?
I think, well, I think that's a good question, and I think time of life matters. But I think that's something that takes a little bit of time to reflect on. And I think it's difficult if you've always been in a large corporation to understand what it might mean. And it might take you a little longer to figure out what a startup really is. A lot of ways it would feel scarier. You have to be prepared for scary, more volatility, more broadness of the way you work. But with that comes thrill, agency, lots of other things. And I think evaluating how you sit in those is probably pretty important.
Do you think it works the other way? People going from startups to BigCo, what do they bring in that situation?
Yeah, I think that they'll bring, and I did that. I've actually lived that transition. And I think, you have an optimism and a belief you can change things. It's actually really helpful. I don't know how much you can actually change, like not to be dismissive, but the belief that you can is actually really powerful. And maybe in people that are more familiar and just accept the status quo, you might change it 1%. And that's often enough in a big company.
And do you think the idea of BigCo to startup, does that change depending on the nature of the work that you were doing? I mean, when you talk about it, I think white collar job, but we're in a situation where lots of people in manufacturing are facing the prospect at any given time. Do you think it changes the way you approach a transition?
It's interesting, probably. I think context really matters. I think personalization really matters to, the experience of each individual. But I think it's about, again, I'll always say it's coming back to understand how you bring value. And I think it's important for us to feel like we're bringing value to our jobs. And so I think if I was in a more hands-on or blue-collar job, I think those are actually, there's more ways you can reapply yourself than you can as a white-collar person, I would think.
That's interesting. How does the work with Life After BigCo connect with your spare parts and gasoline work?
I think there's things we believe in our economy that matter. And I think, when we think about the change we need to drive, we have to help people the talent have access to good opportunities, and good opportunities have access to talent. And so when we lean into this work, we think it's community work. And that's why it's important, because a rising tide raises all boats. So when we help people see options, become more resilient, have more perspectives, it helps both large enterprise and the startup community.
And where do you think Life After BigCo is going to go in the next 2 to 5 years? What's your hope for it?
I don't think change is slowing down. I think people's ability to navigate, I think this is going to be a core problem for the rest of my working life. And so the dream would be that we create supports that actually help people do this, and we grow the economy. To be honest with you, we actually find a way in Canada to be better at this than anybody else in the world. And that leads to more competitive companies, which leads to better lifestyles for us all.
And do you think, sort of looking ahead for spare parts and gasoline on that side of things, what's the future for that?
Same. I think the way we're approaching the work is different. And I believe that organizations of the future are not going to look at consulting organizations the same way. They're going to be looking for impact. They're going to be looking for value. And I think there'll be a real shift away from maybe the traditional consulting companies for certain types of work, where it's agile, where it needs to drive change quickly. At scale, you maybe still want to use the traditional methods in organizations, but I think we'll see organizations like ours move into the more agile, adaptive change.
And how do you think technologies like the elephant in the room of AI are changing that?
Well, I think it's like many factors that are changing all the time. Like I think this is just an example. Like COVID was a big change on us, and right away after that, it's tariffs and it's AI. I just think we're going to be an unrelenting change, and so our job is to get really good at change, really good at resilience, and fight, and not in the sense of creating combats like we're seeing in the world today, but in the sense of fight for our place.
How do you think people can help deal with sort of the idea of fatigue about change? I mean, it's exhausting to constantly going through change.
It is and it isn't, right? I think when we think about change and it's something we're forcing ourselves to do, it's different than when you have agency, when you can insert yourself. I was lucky enough to be some experiences and had some leadership coach me through some big changes that were happening, at the large organization I was working at. And it really made a difference in how I perceived, even though I had no agency, even though I knew it was going to affect me, even though I knew all of that, I was able to kind of rise above it through that coaching. And I would hope that everybody would be able to get that experience and that ability so it doesn't feel so heavy that we're trying to keep up all the time.
Last question. If somebody's in the position where they're going to adapt, where would you recommend they turn for help, resources, where to go for next steps?
Yeah, it's really good. In our community, I think events like this, Inventures and going to places where people meet and talk is really powerful. There's a ton of organizations like, the government does support a lot of change. There's good groups for startups all over the place. It's a bit fragmented, so it can be difficult to navigate, but I would go out and network in the sense of going to coffees, going to meetups, going to those things, and just suspend my beliefs for a little bit and just try to learn.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
For more information on Inventures and innovation here in Alberta and elsewhere across the country, look at digitaljournal.com.